or we're going to jump into lesson 3.4p, which is on factoring to solve quadratics here. So we're going to go ahead and use our factoring method and to solve equations. So we're going to start here with a general idea, and this says find the following values if possible. So if we look at this first one, we've got a times 4 equals 0. So we're asking ourselves, what would a have to be so that this whole equation turns into 0? And hopefully we're thinking, okay, well that means that a has got to be 0 itself, because then we would have 0 times 4, and that would be 0, right? Okay, and so we can use that same idea here for letter B and say that B would have to be 0 here, right? Because then 2 times 0 equals 0, and that's good. Then we get to letter C. It gets a little bit trickier here, but the idea is that if we know that this equation equals 0, then that means that either x has to be 0 or y has to be 0, or they could both be 0, right? But at least one of them has to be 0, okay? And so we can't solve this thing for sure, but we know that at least one of those has to be 0, because that would turn the whole equation into 0. Okay, so I'm going to put x equals 0 or y equals 0. And then we get to letter D. Notice this is the only one that's not equal to 0, right? And that creates a problem for us, because now we don't know what x and y are going to be. There's two variables there. It could be 4 times 2, could be 2 times 4, could be 8 times 1, or 1 times 8. So for this one, it's going to be not possible when we have these two variables. But if we have them equal to 0, it makes it a little bit easier, because then we know at least something has to be equal to 0. So let's take a look at the zero product property here, and that says this. It says if a times b equals 0, so if we multiply two pieces and it equals 0, then we know that at least one of those pieces has to be 0 itself, right? So if we multiply two things together and we get 0, then either the first piece or the second piece has to be 0 itself, because that would turn the whole thing into 0, right? Or they could both be. And that's the zero product property that we're going to use for these equations here. And we've done this when we found x-intercepts. And so basically what you're going to do is you're going to take your factors and you're going to say, okay, well, if this factor times this factor equals 0, then one of those factors has got to be 0 itself, right? So it could be like 0 times x plus 2, or it could be x minus 4 times 0, but one of those factors has got to be 0. And so what we're going to do is take them both and set them equal to 0 and see what would make those factors 0. So I'm going to say x minus 4 equals 0, or the other option is that x plus 2 equals 0, right? Two options there. And then I can solve these. So x is either going to be 4, or subtract 2, x is going to be negative 2. And so those are our two options there for x. Okay, moving to letter B, same idea. I'm going to take both of my factors, set them equal to 0, two separate equations, because I know that x minus 5 equals 0, or the other option is x minus 1 equals 0. So that means x equals 5 or x equals 1. Moving to letter C, same idea here, except we have two factors, right? But it's not a binomial times a binomial. In this case, it's just a monomial times a binomial. So we're just going to say, okay, well, the first is just an x, so that's just x equals 0, and the other option is x plus 3 equals 0. So we don't have to solve that first one, right? That's just our first option, or x could be negative 3. Okay, same idea for letter D. Again, our two factors in this case are a monomial times a binomial, so I'm going to take both of them, set them equal to 0, so that means 2x equals 0, or 3x minus 4 equals 0. And then I would divide both sides by 2, and I would say, okay, well that means x equals 0, or over here, two-step equation, first add 4, then divide by 3, and I get x equals 4 thirds. So we're just taking our two factors, setting them equal to 0, because I know that one of them has to be 0 if I have a 0 on that right side of the equal sign. Moving to letter E, notice this is the first one that's not factored for us, and that's always going to be the key. So I'm going to put a little note here that says factor first So we're going to only use our zero product property here when we have our factors first. So for this one, it's just going to be a GCF, greatest common factor. I can take out a 2x, and that'll leave me x plus 4. And then from there, I can go ahead and set my factors equal to 0. So 2x equals 0, and x plus 4 equals 0. And then solve both of these. So that means x equals 0 or x equals negative 4. Going to letter F, again, we've got a trinomial here that's not factored. So I'm going to go ahead and use my t-chart to factor here. Hopefully you're getting quicker at the t-charts, right? And if not, that's fine. Take your time. I'm going to go through it quickly just for the sake of time here. This would turn into negative 4 and positive 3. And so we'd have x minus 4 and x plus 3 equals 0. And then I would set both of those equal to 0, two separate equations, and solve. So I'd get x equals 4 and x equals negative 3. I'll keep going here. Letter G, this is one of those special cases that we talked about. This is a difference of squares, right, where the middle is a 0x. So as I go ahead and set up my t-chart here, right, I know that I'm looking for that 0x in the middle. So that's going to be x and 3 and negative 3. So my factors look like this, x plus 3 and x minus 3. That's the factored form, but since I'm trying to solve here, I need to set each of these equal to 0. And then subtract 3, so I get x equals negative 3, and add 3, so x equals positive 3. Okay. Moving to letter H, right? Another one that we're going to have to factor here, a little bit more challenging, 3x and x. And then we have a couple different options here. We can either 2 or 1 or 2, and the order does matter. So I'm going to try 1 and 2, and then check my cross products here. That would be a 6x, and that would be a 1x, and that would give me the 7x that I need. So my factors look like they're going to be 3x and a positive 1 from the top row, and x plus 2 from the bottom row. Okay, and then set both of these equal to 0, because I know that one of these factors has got to be 0 if it equals 0. And then I can go ahead and solve. So 3x equals negative 1. That means x equals negative 1/3. And over here, x equals negative 2. All right. And then we keep going here to letter I. Okay, a lot happening on letter I. I'm going to go ahead and have to take out a GCF first before I get into my t-chart. So for this one, I can take out a 2 and an x. And that'll leave me x squared minus 2x minus 15. And now I can still t-chart what's left in here. So that's going to be a x and an x and a negative 5 and a positive 3. And so I'm going to get my factors that look like this. First, I have the 2x that I took out, then x minus 5 and x plus 3. Okay. And for this one, I have 3 factors, right? So that's going to be 3 equations, because I know that if I'm multiplying these 3 factors together and I have a 0 on one side, then one of these 3 factors, at least one of them, has to be equal to 0. So I'm going to set them all equal to 0 separately here. First, 2x equals 0, x minus 5 equals 0, and x plus 3 equals 0. So I get my options as x equals 0, x equals 5, or x equals negative 3. All right, we keep going to the next page. Same idea here. It says solve using the zero product property, but notice for these that we don't have a 0 on one side of the equation, which we need to use the zero product property. So I'm going to have to go ahead and get everything onto one side first in order to use the zero product property. So for this one, I'm going to start by adding 5a to both sides. So that's going to give me a squared plus 5a equals, well, these things are going to cancel out, right, and leave me 0. And now I'm ready to use the zero product property after I factor, of course. So I'm going to factor out an a. That'll leave me a plus 5. And then I'm going to set these equal to 0. So a equals 0. A plus 5 equals 0. So a equals -5 or a equals 0. Same deal on letter B. Right, start by getting a 0 on one side. So I'm going to subtract 2x. And I get 4x squared minus 2x equals 0. And then I'm going to go ahead and factor out greatest common factor. In this case, it's going to be a 2x. And that'll leave me x minus 1. And then set both of these equal to 0. 2x equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. So my answers will be x equals 0 and x equals positive 1. To letter C. First, I'm going to subtract 18. So that's going to give me x squared plus 3x, and then minus an 18 because I'm subtracting it to the other side. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and t-chart this, x and x. Let's see here, we'll end up with 6 and -3. And then set both of those as my factors. And then set them both equal to 0. And maybe we're kind of seeing the pattern here. This is going to turn into x equals -6 and x equals +3 after you set them equal to 0, right? And then you would move them to the other side, all right? Keep going to letter D. Same idea. Start by adding 16 to both sides so that I have a 0 on one side. And I get x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals 0. Use my t-chart here. That's going to be -4 and -4. Okay, so I get a double root here. And so that would be x minus 4 and x minus 4. And that equals 0. And then I can go ahead and solve by setting them equal to 0. Okay, so x minus 4 equals 0. I only need to do it one time, right? Because they're the same root. And I just get x equals 4. I'm going through these quickly, obviously, right, just for the sake of time, but you go through slow, right? Take your time as you need to do the t-charts. Let's go to letter E here. I'm going to go ahead and subtract 9x to move it over, and I'm going to add 9 to move it over. So that's going to give me 2x squared minus 9x plus 9, right? Because those are canceling out and just leaving me 0. And now I'll go ahead and t-chart. This is a tricky t-chart here. 2x and x will give me x squared. And then I'm going to use -3 and -3 because I will multiply to +9. And when I take that cross product there, I'm going to end up with -6x and -3x, which gives me -9x. So my factors are 2x minus 3 and x minus 3 equals 0. Set them both equal to 0. And then I'm going to have to solve. This is a two-step equation for this one. 2x equals +3. And then divide by 2. So I get x equals 3 over 2. And the other option is that x equals +3. And then last one here, letter F, going to go ahead and start by subtracting 2x squared so that I have a 0 over there. And I'm going to write it in standard form, right? So 2x to the third minus 2x squared that I just took from the other side minus 12x. Notice I'm counting down with the exponents there in order. And now I'm going to take out a GCF. In this case, that's going to be 2x. And that'll leave me x squared minus x minus 6. Now I can go ahead and t-chart here. X and x, -3 and 2. And I'm going to go ahead and write my factors as 2x, x minus 3, and x plus 2. And now I can set each one of those equal to 0. So I get 2x equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and x plus 2 equals 0. So if I divide by 2, I get x equals 0, x equals 3, and x equals -2 as my answers. All right, thanks for watching.